Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs.
Today, our speaker is David Malone, discussing his latest book, Does the Elephant Dance?
Today on Global Ethics Forum, Canadian diplomat and Indian foreign policy expert David Malone argues we have a responsibility to understand India's history, geography, and capability in order to analyze its diplomatic behavior.
What shapes the foreign policy of any country? There are a number of ways one could slice and dice it, but I think history, geography, capability are the three headings in which I'll organize my brief remarks this morning. What we think of as India today, a sort of unified country, occurred a number of times over history under short-lived empires, but by and large, India, what we think of India today, was a set of smaller kingdoms, sometimes republics, sometimes other political entities. And when the British came to India, first establishing a toehold in South India, India was in one of its phases of disintegration. The great Mughal Empire was falling apart. Its control was really only in the north of the country, around Delhi. And it was actually quite easy for the British to establish control, ostensibly in the form of the East India Company, over India. There's a sense in the West, a profoundly mistaken sense in the West, that British Empire was an unalloyed good for India. There were a number of positive features of it, and there are positive inheritance of the British Empire, notably the Westminster parliamentary system that the Indians cleave to. The rudiments of an independent judiciary started under the Brits, the railroads, a few other things. But actually, in economic terms, the Brits were an unalloyed disaster for India. British Empire in India was a project of economic exploitation. It was hugely successful for the Brits. It was catastrophic for the Indians. Over the last 20 or 30 years, economic historians, or historians with an interest in economics, and a number of economists with an interest in history have been trying to map out what the world looked like economically in centuries gone by. And a number of interesting publications have come out of the OECD and other places. They calculate that, as a general proposition, China, over the millennia, contributed about 25% of global output at any given time, with variations, and India anywhere between 18 and 20%, with variations. When the British came to India, India was contributing perhaps 17% to global output. When the British left, India was contributing 2% of global output. That's all one needs to know about the British Empire in India. It fueled the Industrial Revolution in Britain, but there was no Industrial Revolution in India itself. The British saw to that. So the Indians have very little reason to look back fondly on British Empire, and their generosity towards it is surprising in some ways. India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, was already thinking about Indian foreign policy in the 20s and 30s when he had lots of time on his hands sampling the hospitality of His Majesty's jails. Like de Gaulle and Churchill, he was a prodigious writer. He wrote enormously during the 20s and 30s, and then when he was prime minister as of 1947, he continued to write prodigiously, but in the form of letters and memoranda and so on, and it's an extraordinary experience to read him. How did he see India's foreign policy shaping up? He saw it as primarily anti-colonial, although he was personally a great Anglophile, and he saw it secondarily as primarily Asian. and indeed convened in New Delhi, even before independence, a conference of Asian powers as the British were packing their bags. Finally, on history, I'd say that since independence, there have been 3 periods of Indian foreign policy. Again, it could be sliced and diced any numbers of ways. This is my way of doing it. Nehru's major preoccupation was to keep India at arm's length from the Cold War. And his way of doing so came to be crystallized in the notion of non-alignment. The philosophy of non-alignment, the instrument, so to speak, guiding Indian foreign policy was to remain free of the entanglements of the Cold War, which led to lasting divisions with Washington, because Washington couldn't understand the greatest democracy of Asia not lining up with the West in the Cold War. Under Nehru, by and large, there was a sense of idealism in Indian foreign policy more than perhaps hard realism, and it came to a hard end with the border war that occurred with China in 1962, that China comprehensively won, India comprehensively lost. And this induced a sense in India that perhaps India had to be more alert to its own interests in the future. Nehru died soon thereafter. His daughter, Indira Gandhi, after a hiatus of 2 years under another Indian prime minister, took over. And she might be described as a hard realist. She took India's interests very seriously. She aligned India much more on the Soviet Union than the mythology of Indian foreign policy at the time allowed. This was a necessity in many ways because India, having rejected Washington in a sense in the early 50s, Washington had aligned quite happily on Pakistan. And China also had aligned quite happily on Pakistan. So India needed a major international power on its side, and the remaining major international power was Moscow. Moscow had little to offer India, but could protect India, for example, in the UN Security Council. When India intervened in the Bangladesh War of Independence, which in effect partitioned Pakistan, it would have been condemned in the UN Security Council were it not for a Russian veto or a Soviet veto at the time. After 1990, India having gone broke in 1990 for a variety of reasons, that introduced a new period of intensely pragmatic foreign policy centered on India's economic self-interest. Security factors matter, of course, and there are significant security worries all over Asia, but the primary driver, I would argue, of Indian foreign policy is Indian prosperity. Whatever is good for Indian prosperity will be pursued. Geography. When you're Canadian, as I am, you realize that geography has been very kind to our country. To the south, we have the United States, which has been pretty tolerant of its occasionally irritating northern neighbor. To the north, we have General Winter, completely impassable. And on either side, huge oceans, which are pretty impassable. India's in a very different situation. It's in a very fractious neighborhood, although it is by far the largest and most powerful country of its sub-region, South Asia. Many of its neighbors present difficulties of various sorts. One tends to think in the West immediately of Pakistan, and Pakistan has been a challenge for India, just as Pakistanis feel India is a major challenge for them. They've engaged in a number of wars, and more recently, a number of skirmishes. But actually today, with India reaching out to the global sphere, sitting at the global table of influence, the G20, which Pakistan does not. There's a sense in India of wanting to outgrow its region, wanting to reach beyond its immediate region. Actually, Indians are much more concerned with another neighbor. If you look at a map of India, what you notice is the entire north of India is overhung by Tibet. And as long as Tibet was Tibet, nobody in India worried particularly. But in 1950, China militarily took over Tibet, and the neighbor became not Tibet, but China. And in China, a new government led by Mao Zedong, a government that Nehru cultivated very actively, saw himself as a champion of, spent time introducing Zhou Enlai around at the Bandung conference, thinking he was doing China a great favor. The Chinese did not perceive Nehru this way. In fact, Zhou Enlai said to a group of Western journalists a few years later of Nehru, "I have never met a more arrogant man." And so the downward slide in Indian-Chinese relations started quite early and long before Nehru realized it had started and culminated in the border war I mentioned. Indians today think of China a lot. There's much they admire about China, China's success, but they worry about it because China's 3 times bigger than India. It's 3 times richer in terms of total GDP, and it's 3 times richer in terms of GDP per capita. That's a big gap. And considering that China still is growing, if the statistics are to be believed, faster than India, the gap is growing rather than shrinking. So it's a concern, particularly at a time when China is investing heavily in military hardware. India, by the way, is investing heavily in military hardware also, quite a lot of it American. And so China is really the big worry because coming back to Nehru's vision of India as primarily an Asian power, the two powers in Asia in the 21st century are likely to be China and India, vying with each other, I think without going to war against each other, for influence and economic success. Nehru invested heavily in science when India became independent, which had all sorts of long-lasting effects. For example, India's space program today, which launches more satellites internationally than any other except the European Space Agency. The science work also focused on weaponry, and India's been quite successful, including in the nuclear field, on that, but as well on agriculture and many other areas, including medicine. What we see since 1990, when India's economic growth really started accelerating, is an India that has, as I mentioned, momentum, has growing capability, and indulges in diplomacy we barely noticed in the West. A lot of Indian diplomacy focuses on groups like IBSA, India, Brazil, South Africa, which is a private sector-driven group of the leading democracies of their continents. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which is about Central Asia and organized by Russia and China primarily. India is an observer. So their diplomacy isn't typical of Western diplomacy. NATO largely irrelevant to them. UN useful at times, but secondary overall. Why? Because India's diplomacy is relentlessly bilateral, establishing good relations with individual countries that can serve India's interests, primarily economic, but secondarily security. It has reached the G20, and it's influential in the G20 because the Prime Minister of India, Dr. Singh, is a leading international economist of his generation. So when he speaks in the G20, people listen. But I want to conclude on capability by one handicap Indian foreign policy suffers from, which is the intensity of domestic politics in India. The United States also has very intense domestic politics that occasionally crowd out the international sphere and a sense of U.S. interest beyond its borders. In India, domestic politics are much more intense than in this country, so the bandwidth available in the political world, particularly in New Delhi, for foreign affairs is very, very limited compared to most countries. And that's, in a sense, an outgrowth of the vibrancy of Indian democracy. I'll conclude with 4 characteristics of Indian foreign policy. I mentioned that Nehru was determined to keep the Cold War at bay, and he was somewhat successful in that. His quest for autonomy at the international level remains at the heart of Indian foreign policy thinking. The Indian nightmare is falling under the domination of one of the other powers in the world today. And so a lot of its behavior internationally that puzzles its friends has to do with the quest for autonomy. Secondly, what geostrategists like to call India's strategic restraint. India is a country with very significant military powers. It doesn't use them much abroad. It uses them quite a bit domestically because there are a variety of insurgencies within India. But if you think of its history with Pakistan since the Bangladesh War of Independence, which involved an Indian intervention into Pakistan, as it then was, India has shown great restraint. Third, the economic priority in its foreign policy, I already mentioned. Finally, a mystery to those of us in the West, the lack of a significant soft power thrust in Indian foreign policy. You'd think that Indian democracy, the very impressive struggle for human rights in India, the vibrancy of Indian civil society, the vibrancy of its politics, would all be themes of Indian foreign policy that it would, in a sense, root some of its foreign policy in. But because its foreign policy is, above all, bilateral, India doesn't make much of its democracy, its own society. Its soft power, in effect, is retailed mostly through a very successful advertising campaign. Many of you will remember the Incredible India advertising campaign, which is mainly about early Indian civilization, stupendous monuments, tourism, and nice beaches. Nothing about the nature of Indian society, which I would argue is its strongest suit, and a very strong suit indeed. If you think of the odds against the survival of Indian unity in 1947, when the British left the country divided with many principalities not yet integrated into India, if you think of the likelihood of Indian democracy surviving in all of its vibrancy in India, in a continent where democracy beyond the trappings of elections hasn't fared very well in most countries, those were very, very long odds. And I would like to see my Indian friends make more of their success in terms of what they are as a polity and as a society.
There have been incidents with Kashmir because it's such a valuable territory. But on the other hand, there have been many attempts of Indian and Pakistani diplomats trying to come together and paper over these things. So would you expand on that?
First, on Kashmir, it has been an open sore in the relationship between India and Pakistan, and it has also colored India's views of the UN, because when Nehru took the issue to the UN in 1947 and 48, He expected India, which had been subject to aggression in Kashmir, to be supported by the UN, but the Security Council, as it so often does, came up with the Solomonic decision. And Indians have been profoundly unhappy with that ever since. The reality is that in Kashmir, a number of things have changed. First of all, I'd say in recent years, because of the radicalization obvious in Pakistani society, Kashmiris who by and large are pretty easygoing in the Kashmir Valley, I'd say have become less attracted to the Pakistani model. Kashmiris in the Kashmiri Valley would like Kashmir to be independent. Very few of them would like to be Pakistani at this point. And that's a very fundamental shift relative to 40 or 50 years ago, when probably many in the Kashmir Valley would have preferred to be Pakistani. What India could do itself, without any reference to Pakistan, is lighten its military occupation of the Kashmir Valley, which is completely unnecessary at its current levels of intensity, redeploy the army simply around the border with Pakistan, and let the Kashmiris live a life without daily repression of the Indian security apparatus. Why? Because the Indian government insists that these Kashmiris must be Indian citizens. Why not treat them like Indian citizens, is my argument. So this is something I think that will eventually occur in India. But one leitmotif in political dialogue in India, and one worry of the body politic in India, is always that somehow the government's going to sell out India and India's interests vis-a-vis Pakistan, and particularly on Kashmir. So successive prime ministers have often come to the brink of interesting initiatives on Kashmir. And Pervez Musharraf in Pakistan came to the brink of a very interesting possible agreement with India, but found himself too weak by then to sell it to the Pakistani parliament, and in particular to sell it to the Pakistani army. India, being a democracy, the Prime Minister of India has to be able to sell to the Indian Parliament, and no party in India has a majority of the Indian Parliament anymore, any agreement on Pakistan or anything else of significance. And so it's been difficult for the leaders of the two countries to muster support for an agreement, and that's why I argue for a unilateral Indian move to relieve the distress of Kashmiris in the Kashmir Valley.
David, you do more justice to India's foreign policy than any Indian diplomat I've heard, so I salute you. I think one of the things that's not so publicly known is that India is one of the largest donors of aid to Afghanistan. In fact, in spite of its impoverishment, India is spending over $1 billion to build an Afghan parliament. Now, with the instability in Afghanistan and the expected withdrawal of the American troops, I'm sure there's a lot of concern in India's foreign policy circles as to the outcome of it. What do you think are some consequences to India with American withdrawal, with continued instability in Afghanistan, and the impact it has on Pakistan?
Well, I'm glad you raised this, because India, in fact, one of the, I'd argue, mistakes of Western policy in Afghanistan has been to think that NATO could achieve significant outcomes on its own in a place as distant from Europe, from the transatlantic region, as Afghanistan, without taking into account the neighbors, and not just Pakistan, which has been taken into account, but other neighbors like China, like Iran, like India, which all have a stake in Afghanistan. I think if we had to do Afghanistan all over again in the West, we might involve regional powers more, which actually Lakhdar Brahimi had sought to do at the Bonn conference at the very outset of international sort of peacemaking involvement in Afghanistan, but then NATO sort of blew that away. We are NATO, don't you know? So India's route to trying to maintain a significant role in Afghanistan, which has, again, profound historic links to India, was this reconstruction program you mentioned, which is a very significant one. Well over $1 billion have been spent, and many of the projects have been quite successful. Road building, hospital building, things like that. India's embassy has been twice attacked in Kabul, very seriously both times, very high casualties. India would like not to lose its historic role in Afghanistan. There's been quite a lot of discussion between the Indian government and, for example, the Russian government about, well, what do we do about our interests in Afghanistan, as you say, as NATO withdraws? There's sometimes thought of trying to revive the Northern Alliance with perhaps Iran. It strikes me that returning to the past isn't terribly helpful for Afghanistan. India was the most reluctant international party to the idea of talks with the Taliban, was probably the last country to endorse that, but has endorsed that now. I think the Indian government, the Indian parliament has to accept that Pakistan is going to play a larger role in Afghanistan than India can, and seek an accommodation where India can play a significant and helpful role alongside Pakistan, which hopefully will also play a more significant and helpful role. I think this idea that India can somehow prevail in Afghanistan against Pakistan is a fantasy which needs to be exploded in India. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for our own special tutorial.
Made possible by the Carnegie Council, the voice for ethics in international affairs. For more information, see www.carnegiecouncil.org.